Filters for landscape photography. Good ones aren't cheap, and cheap ones may not be all that good. It's very easy to spend a lot of money on filters, but do you really need them? Or are you better off spending the money on something else? In this video, I want to look at the 3 main types of filters used in landscape photography, talk through what they're for, what the alternatives are, and how your particular style and the type of landscape photography you want to do determines whether you really need these or not. Hi everyone, thank you for joining me. So in this video I'm talking about filters, but before I get onto that, this is a quick message for anybody that's new here. I'm a landscape photographer. The majority of my videos are out in the field doing landscape photography, maybe throwing in the occasional tips and a little bit of tutorials here and there. And occasionally I do sort of processing and sometimes gear related videos like I'm doing today. So if that's the kind of thing you like, don't forget to hit subscribe before you go. So let's get started by talking about this fellow, which is the ND Grad, or neutral density graduated filter. A pretty simple idea. Part of it is dark, part of it is clear. And what you do is you use the dark part to darken part of the scene, typically the sky, in order to be able to get the exposure to balance when you're taking the image. Particularly useful in early in the morning or late in the evening when you can have a very shadowy foreground and a very bright sky. They come in all sorts of different variants and strengths. So for example, this is a 0.6, which is 2 stops. This one, take the same way up, is a, no sorry, wrong way around. This is a 0.6, which is a 2 stop, and this is a 0.9, which is a 3 stop. They also come in different transitions. So this 2 stop is a hard edge, so you can see it's got a pretty sharp transition between dark and light, whereas this one, which is also 2 stops, is a soft edge, so it has a very gradual transition between dark and light. You also get medium edged, which has somewhere in between, and even reversed ND Grads, where the dark bit is kind of in the middle here, and then it gets lighter going this way and is clear at the bottom. But do you really need them? What's the alternatives to the neutral density graduated filter? Well, the first thing to mention is that the dynamic range on modern cameras, so their ability to deal with significant amounts of contrast, is far superior to what it was even a few years ago. And in many cases you can get away with just shooting exposed correctly for the highlights, so making sure you're not blowing any of the highlights out but still making the image as bright as possible, and then just boosting the exposure and the shadows in the darker areas and recovering that detail. And you can do so on a lot of images without introducing a lot of noise and reducing quality. But there will be cases when that's not going to work, and you're going to end up with such a dark foreground area or just such a dark area of the image that recovering that detail is going to ruin the quality. So you can use a filter, as we've already looked at, or you can shoot multiple exposures. You can shoot one exposure correctly exposed for the highlights, one for the shadows, and maybe one in the middle, and then you can merge them later in Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever software you use as a matter of choice. That mechanism of shooting, one in the middle and one either side, is typically called bracketing. So it's very, very easy to get an image to work without using an ND Grad. And in fact, I would say I've never actually absolutely needed an ND Grad. There's always been an alternative way to get the image to work, but there are times when they come in handy. For example, if you're trying to capture something quite dynamic where you're waiting for a very, very specific scene, for something that's very short-lived to happen, like photographing waves breaking on rocks, I want to be concentrating on what the waves are doing and capturing that perfect moment, and not worrying about the fact that I've actually got to shoot multiple exposures to get the dynamic range to work. So they're useful if you like doing that kind of thing. And so if that's the kind of thing you like doing, maybe they are necessary for you, or at least helpful. But when it comes down to it, if we're looking at budget and what we're going to have to spend money on, this is probably the last type of filter that I would think of spending money on. Useful, but not absolutely essential. Okay, now let's talk about the next filter, which is the ND filter. The ND, or neutral density filter, is nothing more than a very dark piece of glass or plastic that reduces the amount of light coming into the lens, enabling you to extend your exposure time in order to blur movement. Typically that's blurring water or blurring clouds. They come in various different forms, ranging from, like 1 or 2 stops up to 16 stops. I have 2 here. This one is a 6 stop, and that will turn a 1/30th of a second exposure into a 2-second exposure. And this one is a 10 stop, and that will turn a 1/30th of a second exposure into 30 seconds, I think. Without actually looking it up, I don't know, but I think 30 seconds. So they're very useful for getting those long exposure images when you see, water that's absolutely flattened out, streaky clouds in the sky, when you get those minimalist shots with just one sort of textured object sticking out of what looks like maybe mist or something like that. They can be very useful for that, and indeed for doing waterfalls, perhaps where you only want to get a shorter exposure, half a second, but just to create that sense of movement and get that kind of silky feel to them. The alternatives, well, the obvious alternative is to shoot when the ambient light is low. So go out early in the morning before the sun comes up and shoot when it's still fairly dark, and you can get very long exposures that way. Or after the sun has gone down, when it's getting darker, you can get long exposures that way. The other way you can get long exposures is to shoot several different images over a short period of time. So a number of shorter exposures over several seconds or several minutes, and then you can blend those in Photoshop using one of the average blend modes like mean or median. And what that will do is create a long exposure effect. That can work really well, although sometimes if you've left too long between each of the shots, you can get an unevenness, almost like a jaggedness to it, which doesn't look very nice. But it is a very effective way of doing it. So probably the best way to do long exposures without the filters is the first one. Go out with when it's still fairly dark. Do you absolutely need these? No, but if long exposures is your thing, if you like that effect and you want to be doing lots of it, these are probably a good filter to look at investing money in. And I think the 6 stop and the 10 stop are probably some of the best you can go for. And of course you can stack those. I've stacked these before to give me 16 stops. And in bright sunlight you can get a 5, 6, 7 minute exposure with those 2 stacked. So the third and final filter to talk about is the polarizer, or the circular polarizing filter. The polarizer does a couple of different things. The first thing it does is it boosts saturation and contrast, and it does that particularly if the source of light, typically the sun, is coming from 90 degrees. So a 90-degree light source will have the polarizer doing its absolute maximum. And polarizers are adjustable. You screw them on and then they actually rotate, so you can affect how much polarization there actually is. As I said, they will boost saturation and contrast. So if you've got a blue sky with lots of lovely white fluffy clouds, a polarizer is going to make that really pop. And likewise, it will make other scenes, much more saturated and much more contrasty. The other thing it will do is it will cut back and cut out reflected light. So if you've got a water surface and underneath that water you have some really nice rocks or some plants, whatever it might be that you actually want to be able to see through the water, then putting the polarizer on will let you cut out the reflected light coming off of the water and see through to the surface underneath. And in the same way, if you've got a wet surface which is reflecting light and creating glare, hot spots in the image, the polarizer will help to cut that out and take that glare out of the image. The alternatives, well, in terms of the first thing that the polarizer does with contrast and saturation, that's easily achievable in post-production. You just use the saturation and contrast sliders either globally or locally. As far as the second part is concerned, taking out reflected light and letting you see through water or take glare off of wet objects, there is no alternative. There is nothing that you can do in post-production that will replicate what the circular polarizer does. So if your style of photography involves a lot of waterfalls, rivers, wet rocks, wet foliage, if you do a lot of woodland photography where you've got wet leaves which are going to create glare, then this is going to be a really, really important filter for you to have. If you don't do a lot of that, actually you probably won't use it that much. And I've got to be honest, I don't use the circular polarizer all that often unless I'm shooting waterfalls or moving water. I don't use it for sunrises and sunsets. I don't use it for the vast majority of things that I do. But if I've got a river or a waterfall, I will quite often break out the circular polarizer. So that brings me to the end of my Do You Need Filters video. And the answer, as always, is not perhaps that simple. ND Grads, they are nice to have, but I wouldn't invest money in them if you can invest it better in something else. ND filters, well, if you like doing long exposures, yeah, they're probably a good thing to have, although heading out early, heading out late, shooting in low light is another way to achieve it. And the circular polarizer, if waterfalls, rivers and woodland scenes with wet foliage is your thing, then you definitely want to be investing in one of these. Otherwise, well, I guess it's up to you. If you've got the money to spare, it's a nice thing to have in the kit bag, but if not, why bother? I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, don't forget about hitting that like button, giving it a share on social media. Leave me a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are on filters. Do you use them? Do you hate them? Some people do. And as I said at the beginning, if you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe before you go. As always, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch, so thank you very much. And until the next video, bye.